Section 6 of Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Caron. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2, Section 6, Chapters 25 through 29. Chapter 25. I had a tennis court in my castle, from which I drew considerable profit. The building also contained some little dwellings inhabited by different sorts of men, among whom was a printer of books of much excellence in his own trade. Nearly the whole of his premises lay inside the castle, and he was the man who printed Messer Guido's first fine book on medicine. Wanting to make use of his lodging, I turned him out, but now without some trouble. There was also a manufacturer of saltpetre, and when I wished to assign his apartments to some of my German workmen, the fellow refused to leave the place. I asked him over and over again in gentle terms to give me up my rooms, because I wanted to employ them for my work people in the service of the king. The more moderately I spoke, the more arrogantly did the brute reply, till at last I gave him 3 days' notice to quit. He laughed me in the face, and said that he would begin to think of it at the end of 3 years. I had not then learned that he was under the protection of Madame d'Etampes, but had it not been that the terms on which I stood toward that lady made me a little more circumspect than I was wont to be, I should have outstead him at once. Now, however, I thought it best to keep my temper for 3 days. When the term was over, I said nothing, but took Germans, Italians, and Frenchmen, bearing arms, as many hand laborers whom I had in my employ, and in a short while guttered all his house and flung his property outside my castle. I resorted to these somewhat rigorous measures, because he had told me that no Italian whom he knew of had the power of spirit to remove one ring of iron from its place in his house. Well, after the deed was done, he came to find me, and I said to him, "I am the least of all Italians in Italy, and yet I have done nothing to you in comparison with what I have the heart to do, and will do if you utter a single further word." Adding other terms of menace and abuse, the man, dumbfounded and affrighted, got his furniture together as well as he was able. Then he ran up to Madame d'Etampes, and painted a picture of me like the very fiend. She, being my great enemy, painted my portrait still blacker to the king, with all her greater eloquence, and all her greater weight of influence. As I was afterwards informed, his Majesty twice showed signs of irritation, and was minded to use me roughly. But Henry the Dauphin, his son, now King of France, who had received some affronts from that imperious woman, together with the Queen of Navarre, sister to King Francis, espoused my cause so cleverly that he passed the matter over with a laugh. So with God's assistance I escaped from a great danger. Chapter 26. I had to deal in like manner with another fellow, but I did not ruin his house. I only threw all his furniture out of doors. This time Madame d'Etampes had the insolence to tell the king, "I believe that devil will sack Paris one of these days." The king answered with some anger that I was only quite right to defend myself from the low rabble who put obstacles in the way of my serving him. The rage of this vindictive woman kept continually on the increase. She sent for a painter who was established at Fontainebleau, where the king resided nearly all this time. The painter was an Italian, and a Bolognese, known then as Il Bologna. His right name, however, was Francesco Primaticcio. Madame d'Etampes advised him to beg that commission for the fountain which his Majesty had given me, adding that she would support him with all her ability, and upon this they agreed. Bologna was in an ecstasy of happiness, and thought himself sure of the affair, although such things were not in his line of art. He was, however, an excellent master of design, and had collected round him a troop of work people formed in the school of Rosso, our Florentine painter, who was undoubtedly an artist of extraordinary merit. His own best qualities, indeed, were derived from the admirable manner of Rosso, who by this time had died. These ingenious arguments, and the weighty influence of Madame d'Etampes, prevailed with the king, for they kept hammering at him night and day. Madame at one time, and Bologna at another. What worked most upon his mind was that both of them combined to speak as follows: "How is it possible, sacred Majesty, that Benvenuto should accomplish the 12 silver statues which you want? He has not finished one of them yet. If you employ him on so great an undertaking, you will of necessity deprive yourself of those other things on which your heart is set. 100 of the ablest craftsmen could not complete so many great works as this one able man has taken in hand to do. One can see clearly that he has a passion for labor. But this ardent temper will be the cause of your Majesty's losing both him and his masterpieces at the same moment." By insinuating these and other suggestions of the same sort, a favorable opportunity, the king consented to their petition. And yet Bologna had at this time produced neither designs nor models for the fountain. Chapter 27. It happened that just at this period an action was brought against me in Paris by the second lodger I had ousted from my castle, who pretended that, on that occasion, I had stolen a large quantity of his effects. This lawsuit tormented me beyond measure, and took up so much of my time that I often thought of decamping in despair from the country. Now the French are in the habit of making such capital out of any action they commence against a foreigner, or against such persons as they notice to be indolent in litigation. No sooner do they observe that they are gaining some advantage in the suit, than they find the means to sell it. Some have been known to give a lawsuit in dowry with their daughters to men who make a business out of such transactions. They have another ugly custom, which is that the Normans, nearly all of them, traffic in false evidence, so that the men who buy up lawsuits engage at once the services of 4 or 6 of these false witnesses, according to their need. Their adversary, if he neglect to produce as many on the other side, being perhaps unacquainted with the custom, is certain to have the verdict given against him. All this happened in my case, and thinking it a most disgraceful breach of justice, I made my appearance in the great hall of Paris to defend my right. There I saw a judge, lieutenant for the king in civil causes, enthroned upon a high tribunal. He was tall, stout, and fat, and of an extremely severe countenance. All round him, on each side, stood a crowd of solicitors and advocates, ranged upon the right hand and the left. Others were coming, one by one, to explain their several causes to the judge. From time to time, too, I noticed that the attorney at the side of the tribunal talked all at once, and much admiration was roused in me by that extraordinary man, the very image of Pluto, who listened with marked attention, first to one and then to the other, answering each with learning and sagacity. I have always delighted in watching and experiencing every kind of skill, so I would not have lost this spectacle for much. It happened that the hall being very large, and filled with a multitude of folk, they were strict in excluding every one who had no business there, and kept the door shut with a guard to hold it. Sometimes the guardian, in his effort to prevent the entrance of some improper person, interrupted the judge by the great noise he made, and the judge in anger turned to chide him. This happened frequently, so that my attention was directed to the fact, on one occasion, when 2 gentlemen were pushing their way in as spectators, and the porter was opposing them with violence. The judge raised his voice, and spoke the following words precisely as I heard them: "Keep peace, Satan, be gone, and hold your tongue." Those words in the French tongue sound as follows: "Fais, fais, Satan, fais, fais, elle fait." Now I had learned the French tongue well, and on hearing this sentence, the meaning of that phrase used by Dante came into my memory when he and his master Virgil entered the doors of hell. Dante and the painter Giotto were together in France, and particularly in the city of Paris, where, owing to the circumstances I have just described, the Hall of Justice may be truly called a hell. Dante, then, who also understood French, well made use of the phrase in question, and it has struck me as singular that this interpretation has never been put upon the passage. Indeed, it confirms my opinion that the commentators make him say things which never came into his head. Chapter 28. Well, then, to return to my affairs. When certain decisions of the court were sent me by those lawyers, and I perceived that my cause had been unjustly lost, I had recourse for my defense to a great dagger which I carried, for I have always taken pleasure in keeping fine weapons. The first man I attacked was the plaintiff, who had sued me, and one evening I wounded him in the legs and arms so severely, taking care, however, not to kill him, that I deprived him of the use of both his legs. Then I sought out the other fellow who had brought the suit, and used him also in such wise that he dropped it. Returning thanks to God for this and every other dispensation, and hoping to be left a while without worries, I bade the young men of my household, especially the Italians, for God's sake to attend each diligently to the work I set him, and to help me till such time as I could finish the things I had in hand. I thought they might soon be completed, and then I meant to return to Italy, being no longer able to put up the rogueries of those Frenchmen. The good king, too, if he once grew angry, he might bring me into mischief for many of my acts in self-defense. I will describe who these Italians were. The first, and the one I liked best, was Ascanio, from Tagliacozzo, in the kingdom of Naples. The second was Pagolo, a Roman of such humble origin that he did now know his own father. These were the two men who had been with me in Rome, and whom I had taken with me on the journey. Another Roman had also come on purpose to enter my service. He, too, bore the name of Pagolo, and was the son of a poor nobleman of the family of the Macaroni. He had small acquirements in our art, but was excellent and courageous swordsman. I had another from Ferrara called Bartolomeo Chioscia. There was also another from Florence named Pagolo Messeri. His brother, nicknamed Il Gatta, was a clever clerk, but had spent too much money in managing the property of Tommaso Guadagni, a very wealthy merchant. This Gatta put in order for me the books in which I wrote the accounts of his most Christian Majesty, and my other employers. Now Pagolo Messeri, having learned how to keep them from his brother, went on doing this work for me in return for a liberal salary. He appeared, so far as I could judge, to be a very honest lad, for I noticed him to be devout, and when I heard him sometimes muttering psalms and sometimes telling his beads, I reckoned much upon his fine virtue. Accordingly I called the fellow apart and said to him, "Pagolo, my dearest brother, you know what a good place you have with me, and how you had formerly nothing to depend on. Besides, you are a Florentine. I have also the greater confidence in you, because I observe that you are pious and religious, which is a thing that pleases me. I beg you, therefore, to assist me, for I cannot put the same trust in any of your companions. So then I shall ask you to keep watch over two matters of the highest importance, which might prove a source of much annoyance to me. In the first place, I want you to guard my property from being stolen, and not touch it yourself. In the next place, you know that poor young girl, Caterina. I keep her principally for my art's sake, since I cannot do without a model. But being a man also, I have used her for my pleasures, and it is possible that she may bear me a child. Now I do not want to maintain another man's bastards, nor will I sit down under such an insult. If any one of this house had the audacity to attempt anything of the sort, and I were to become aware of it, I verily believe that I should kill both her and him. Accordingly, dear brother, I entreat you to be my helper. Should you notice anything, tell it me at once, for I am sure to send her and her mother and her fellow to the gallows. Be you the first upon your watch against falling into this snare." The rascal made a sign of the cross from his head to his feet, and cried out, "O blessed Jesus, God preserve me from ever thinking of such a thing! In the first place, I am not given to those evil ways. In the next place, do you imagine I am ignorant of your great benefits toward me?" When I heard these words, which he uttered with all appearance of simplicity and affection for me, I believed that matters stood precisely as he asserted. Chapter 29. 2 days after this conversation, M. Matteo del Nazaro took the occasion of some feast day to invite me and my work-people to an entertainment in a garden. He was an Italian in the king's service, and practised the same art as we did with remarkable ability. I got myself in readiness, and told Pagolo that he might go abroad too and amuse himself with us, the annoyances arising from that lawsuit being, as I judged, now settled down. The young man replied in these words: "Upon my word, it will be a great mistake to leave the house so unprotected. Only look how much of gold, silver, and jewels you have here. Living as we do in a city of thieves, we ought to be upon our guard by day and night. I will spend my time in religious exercises, while I keep watch over the premises. Go then with mind at rest to take your pleasure and divert your spirits. Some other day another man will take my place as guardian here." Thinking that I could go of with a quiet mind, I took Pagolo, Ascanio, and Chioccia to the garden, where we spent a large portion of the day agreeably. Toward the middle of the afternoon, however, when it began to draw toward sundown, a suspicion came into my head, and I recollected the words which what traitor had spoken with his feigned simplicity. So I mounted my horse, and with 2 servants to attend me, I returned to the castle, where I all but caught Pagolo, and in that little wretch, Caterina, in flagrante. No sooner had I reached the place than that French bawd, her mother, screamed out, "Pagolo! Caterina! Here is the master!" When I saw the pair advancing, overcome with fright, their clothes in disorder, not knowing what they said, nor like people in a trance, where they were going, it was only too easy to guess what they had been about. The sight drowned reason in rage, and I drew my sword, resolved to kill them both. The man took to his heels. The girl flung herself upon her knees, and shrieked to heaven for mercy. In my first fury I wanted to strike at the male, but before I had time to catch him up, second thoughts arose, which made me think it would be best for me to drive them both away together. I had so many acts of violence upon my hands, that if I killed him, I could hardly hope to save my life. I said then to Pagolo, "Had I seen with my own eyes, Grundle, what your behaviour and appearance to force me to believe, I should have run you with this sword here 10 times through the guts. Get out of my sight, and if you say a paternoster, let it be San Giuliano's." Then I drove the whole lot forth, mother and daughter, lambing into them with fist and foot. They made their minds up to have the law of me, and consulted a Norman advocate, who advised them to declare that I had used the girl after Italian fashion. What this meant, I need hardly explain. The man argued, "At the very least, when this Italian hears what you are after, he will pay down several hundred ducats, knowing how great the danger is, and how heavily that offence is punished in France." Upon this they were agreed. The accusation was brought against me, and I received a summons from the court. End of Section 6. Recording by Chris Caron, Ham Lake, Minnesota. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2, Section 7, Chapters 30 through 33. Chapter 30. The more I sought for rest, the more I was annoyed with all sorts of embarrassments, being thus daily exposed to divers persecutions. I pondered which of 2 courses I ought to take, whether to decamp and leave France to the devil, or else to fight this battle, though I had done the rest, and see to what end God had made me. For a long while I kept anxiously revolving the matter. At last I resolved to make off, dreading my evil fortune, lest this should bring me to the gallows. My dispositions were all fixed, and I had made arrangements for putting away the property I could not carry, and for changing the lighter articles, to the best of my ability, upon myself and servants. Yet it was with great and heavy reluctance that I looked forward to such a departure. I had shut myself up alone in a little study. My young men were advising me to fly, but I told them that it would be well for me to meditate this step in solitude, although I very much inclined to their opinion. Indeed, I reasoned that if I could escape imprisonment, and let the storm pass over, I should be able to explain matters to the king by letter, setting forth the trap which had been laid to ruin me by the malice of my enemies. And as I have said above, my mind was made up to this point, when just as I rose to act on the decision, some power took me by the shoulder and turned me round, and I heard a voice which cried with vehemence, "Benvenuto, do as thou art wont, and fear not." Then on the instant I changed the whole course of my plans, and said to my Italians, "Take your good arms and come with me. Obey me to the letter. Have no other thought, for I am now determined to put in my appearance. If I were to leave Paris, you would vanish the next day in smoke. Do so as I command, and follow me." They all began together with one heart and voice to say, "Since we are here and draw our livelihood from him, it is our duty to go with him and bear him out so long as we have life to execute what he proposes. He has hit the mark better than we did in this matter, for on the instant when he leaves the place, his enemies will send us to the devil. Let us keep well in mind what great works we have begun here, and what vast importance they possess. We should not know how to finish them without him, and his enemies would say that he had taken flight because he shrank before such undertakings." Many other things bearing weightily upon the subject were said among them, but it was the young Roman, Macaroni, who first put heart into the company, and he also raised recruits from the Germans and the Frenchmen, who felt well disposed toward me. We were 10 men, all counted. I set out, firmly resolved not to let myself be taken and imprisoned alive. When we appeared before the judges for criminal affairs, I found Caterina and her mother waiting, and on the moment of my arrival the 2 women were laughing with their advocate. I pushed my way in, and called boldly for the judge, who was seated, blown out big and fat, upon a tribunal high above the rest. On catching sight of me, he threatened with his head, and spoke in a subdued voice, "Although your name is Benvenuto, this time you are an ill-comer." I understood his speech, and called out the second time, "Dispatch my business quickly. Tell me what I have come to do here." Then the judge turned to Caterina and said, "Caterina, relate all that happened between you and Benvenuto." She answered that I had used her after the Italian fashion. The judge turned to me and said, "You hear what Caterina disposes, Benvenuto." I replied, "If I have consorted with her after the Italian fashion, I have only done the same as you folk of other nations do." He demurred. "She means that you improperly abused her." I retorted that, so far from being the Italian fashion, it must be some French habit, seeing she knew all about it, while I was ignorant, and I commanded her to explain precisely how I had consorted with her. Then the impudent baggage entered into plain and circumstantial details regarding all the filth she lyingly accused me of. I made her repeat her disposition 3 times in succession. When she had finished, I cried out with a loud voice, "Lord Judge, Lieutenant of the Most Christian King, I call on you for justice. Well I know that by the laws of his Most Christian Majesty both agent and patient in this kind of crime are punished with the stake. The woman confesses her guilt. I admit nothing whatsoever of the sort with regard to her. Her go-between of a mother is here, who deserves to be burned for either one or the other offence. Therefore I appeal to you for justice." These words I repeated over and over again at the top of my voice, continually calling out, "To the stake with her and her mother!" I also threatened the judge that, if he did not send her to prison there before me, I would go to the king at once, and tell him how his lieutenant in criminal affairs of justice had wronged me. When they heard what a tumult I was making, My adversaries lowered their voices, but I lifted mine the more. The little hussy and her mother fell to weeping, while I shouted to the judge, "Fire! Fire! To the stake with them!" The coward on the bench, finding that the matter was not going as he intended, began to use soft words and excuse the weakness of the female sex. Thereupon I felt that I had won the victory in a nasty encounter, and muttering threats between my teeth, I took myself off, not without great inward satisfaction. Indeed, I would gladly have paid 500 crowns down to have avoided that appearance in court. However, after escaping from the tempest, I thanked God with all my heart, and returned in gladness with my young men to the castle. Chapter 31. When adverse fortune, or if we prefer to call it, our malignant planet, undertakes to persecute a man, it never lacks new ways of inquiring them, of injuring them. So now, when I thought I had emerged from this tempestuous sea of troubles, and hoped my civil star would leave me quiet for a moment, it began to set two schemes in motion against me. Before I had recovered my breath from that great struggle, within 3 days 2 things have happened, each of which brought my life into extreme hazard. One of these occurred in this way. I went to Fontainebleau to consult with the king, for he had written me a letter saying he wanted me to stamp the coins of his whole realm, and enclosing some little drawings to explain his wishes in the matter. At the same time he left me to freely execute them as I liked, upon which I made new designs according to my own conception, and according to the ideal of art. When I reached Fontainebleau, one of the treasurers commissioned by the king to defray my expenses, he was called Monsignor de la Fa, addressed me in these words: "Benvenuto, the painter Bologna has obtained commission from the king to execute your great Colosseum, and all the orders previously given as on your behalf have been transferred to him. We are all indignant, and it seems to us that countryman of yours has acted towards you in a most unwarrantable manner. The work has assigned you on the strength of your models and studies. He is robbing you of it only through the favor of Madame d'Etampes, and though several months have passed since he received the order, he has not yet made any sign of commencing it." I answered in surprise, "How is it possible that I should have heard nothing at all about this?" He then informed me that the man had kept it very dark, and had obtained the king's commission with great difficulty, since his Majesty at first would not concede it. Only the importunity of Madame d'Etampes secured this favor for him. When I felt how gratefully and how wrongfully I had been betrayed, and saw a work which I had gained with my great toil thus stolen from me, I made my mind up for a serious stroke of business, and marched off with my good sword at my side to find Bologna. He was asked in his room, engaged in studies. After telling the servant to introduce me, he greeted me with some of his Lombard compliments, and asked what good business had brought me hither. I replied, "A most excellent business, and what of great importance." He then sent for wine, and said, "Before we begin to talk, we must drink together, for such is the French custom." I answered, "Messer Francesco, you must know that the conversation we have to engage in does not call for drinking at the commencement. After it is over, perhaps we shall be glad to take a glass." Then I opened the matter this way: "All men who wish to pass for persons of worth allow it to be seen that they are so by their actions. If they do the contrary, they lose the name of honest men. I am aware that you knew the king had commissioned me with the great Colosseum. It had been talked of these 18 months past, yet neither you nor anybody else came forward to speak a word about it. By my great labors I made myself down to his Majesty, who approved of my models and gave the work into my hands. During many months I have heard nothing to the contrary. Only this morning I was informed that you have got hold of it, and have filched it from me. I earned it by the talents I displayed, and you are robbing me of it merely by your idle talking." Chapter 32. To this speech Bologna answered, "O Benvenuto, all men try to push their affairs in every way they can. If this is the king's will, what have you to say against it? You would only throw away your time. because I have it now, and it is mine. Now tell me what you choose, and I will listen to you." I replied, "I should like you to know, Messer Francesco, that I could say much which would prove irrefragably, and make you admit, that such ways of acting as you have described and used are not in vogue among rational animals. I will, however, come quickly to the point at issue. Give close attention to my meaning, because the affair is serious." He made as though he would rise from the chair on which he was sitting, since he saw my colour heightened and my features greatly discomposed. I told him that the time had not yet come for moving. He had better sit and listen to me. Then I recommended Messer Francesco. You know that I first received the work, and that the time has long gone by during which by right could be reasonably disputed by anyone. Now I tell you that I shall be satisfied if you will make a model, while I make another in addition to the one I have already shown. Then we will make them without any clamour to our great king. And whatsoever in this way I shall have gained the credit of the best design, I will justly have deserved the commission. If it falls for you, I will dismiss from my mind the memory of the great injury you have done me, and will bless your hands as being worthier than mine. If so glorious a performance, let us abide by this arrangement, and we shall be friends, otherwise we must be enemies. And God, who always helps the right, and I, who know how to assert it, will show you to what extent you have done wrong." Messer Francesco answered, "The work is mine, and since it has been given to me, I do not choose to put what is my own to hazard." To this I retorted, "Messer Francesco, if you will not take the right course, which is just and reasonable, I will show you another which shall be like your own, that is to say, ugly and disagreeable. I tell you plainly that if I ever hear that you have spoken one single word about this work of mine, I will kill you like a dog. We are neither in Rome, nor in Bologna, nor in Florence. Here one lives in quite a different fashion. If then it comes to my ears that you talk about this to the king or anybody else, I vow that I will kill you. Reflect upon the way you mean to take, whether that for good, which I formerly described, or this later bad one I have just now set before you." The man did not know what to say or do, as I was inclined to cut the matter short upon the spot, rather than to postpone action. Bologna found no other words than these to utter: "If I act like a man of honesty, I shall stand in no fear." I replied, "You have spoken well, but if you act otherwise, you will have to fear, because the affair is serious." Upon this I left him, and betook myself to the king. With his Majesty I disputed some time about the fashion of his coinage, a point upon which we were not of the same opinion. His council, who were present, kept persuading him that the monies ought to be struck in the French style, as they had hitherto always been done. I urged in reply that his Majesty had sent for me from Italy in order that I might execute good work. If he now wanted me to do the contrary, I could not bring myself to submit, so the matter was postponed till another occasion, and I set off again at once for Paris. Chapter 33. I had but just dismounted from my horse, when one of those excellent people who rejoice in mischief making came to tell me that Pagolo Messeri had taken a house for the little hussy Caterina and her mother, and that he was always going there, and whenever he mentioned me, used words of scorn to this effect: "Benvenuto set the fox to watch the grapes, and thought I would not eat them. Now he is satisfied with going about and talking big, and thinks I am afraid of him. But I have girt this sword and dagger to my side, in order to show him that my steel can cut as well as his, and that I too am a Florentine of the Messeri, a far better family than his Cellini." The scoundrel who reported this poisonous gossip struck it with such a good effect, that I felt a fever in the instant swoop upon me. And when I say fever, I mean fever, and no mere metaphor. The insane passion which took possession of me might have been my death, had I not resolved to give it vent as the occasion offered. I ordered the Ferris workman, Chioccia, to come with me, and made a servant follow with my house. When we reached the house where that worthless villain was, I found the door ajar, and entered. I noticed that he carried sword and dagger, and was sitting on a big chest, with his arm round Caterina's neck. At the moment of my arrival, I could hear that he and her mother were talking about me. Pushing the door open, I drew my sword, and set the point of it at his throat, not giving him the time to think whether he too carried steel. At the same instant I cried out, "Vile coward! Recommend your soul to God, for you are a dead man." Without budging from his seat, he called 3 times, "Mother, mother, help me!" though I had come there fully determined to take his life. Half my fury ebbed away when I heard this idiotic exclamation. I ought to add that I had told Chioccia not to let the girl or her mother leave the house, since I meant to deal with those trollops after I had disposed of their bully. So I went on, holding my sword at his throat, and now and then just pricked him with the point, pouring out a torrent of terrific threats at the same time. But when I found he did not stir a finger in his own defence, I began to wonder what I should do next. My menacing attitude could not be kept up for ever, so at last it came into my head to make them marry, and complete my vengeance at a later period. Accordingly, I formed my resolution, and began, "Take that ring, coward, from your finger, and marry her, that I may get satisfaction from you afterwards, according to your deserts." He replied at once, "If only you do not kill me, I will do whatever you command." "Then," said I, "put that ring upon her hand." When the sword's point was withdrawn a few inches from his throat, he wedded her with the ring. But I added, "This is not enough. I shall send for 2 notaries, in order that the marriage may be ratified by contract." Bidding Chioccia go for the lawyers, I turned to the girl and her mother, and using the French language, spoke as follows: "Notaries and witnesses are coming. The first of you who blabs about this affair will be killed upon the spot. Nay, I will murder you all 3. So beware and keep a quiet tongue in your hands." To him I said in Italian, "If you offer any resistance to what I shall propose, upon the slightest word you utter, I will stab you till your guts run out upon this floor." He answered, "Only promise not to kill me, and I will do whatever you command." The notaries and witnesses arrived. A contract, valid and in due form, was drawn up. Then my heat and forever left me. I paid the lawyers and took my departure. On the following day Bologna came to Paris on purpose, and sent for me through Matteo del Nassaro. I went to see him, and he met me with a glad face, entreating me to regard him as a brother, and saying that he would never speak about that work again, since he recognized quite well that I was right. End of section 7. Recording by Chris Caron, Ham Lake, Minnesota.
Section 8 of Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jersey City Frankie. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2, Section 8, Chapters 34 through 39. Chapter 34. If I did not confess that in some of these episodes I acted wrongly, the world might think I was not telling the truth about those in which I say I acted rightly. Therefore I admit that it was a mistake to inflict so singular a vengeance upon Pagolo Micceri. In truth, I had believed him to be so utterly feeble I should not have conceived the notion of branding him with such infamy as I am going to relate. Not satisfied with having made him take a vicious drab to wife, I completed my revenge by inviting her to sit to me as a model. In dealing with her thus, I gave her 30 sous a day, paid in advance, and a good meal, and obliged her to pose before me naked. Then I made her serve my pleasure, out of spite against her husband, jeering at them both the while. Furthermore, I kept her for hours together in position, greatly to her discomfort. This gave her as much annoyance as it gave me pleasure, for she was beautifully made, and brought to me much credit as a model. At last, noticing that I did not treat her with the same consideration as before her marriage, she began to grumble and talk big in her French way about her husband, who was now serving the prior of Capua, a brother of Piero Strozzi. On the first occasion when she did this, the mere mention of the fellow aroused me to intolerable fury. Still I bore it, greatly against the grain, as well as I was able, reflecting that I could hardly find so suitable a subject for my art as she was. So I reasoned thus in my own mind: I am now taking two different kinds of revenge. In the first place, she is married, and what I am doing to her husband is something far more serious than what he did to me, when she was only a girl of loose life. If, then, I wreak my spite so fully upon him, while upon her I inflict the discomfort of posing in such strange attitudes for such a length of time, which, beside the pleasure I derive, brings me both profit and credit through my art, what more can I desire? While I was turning over these calculations, the wretch redoubled her insulting speeches, always prating big about her husband, till she goaded me beyond the bounds of reason. Yielding myself up to blind rage, I seized her by the hair, and dragging her up and down my room, beating and kicking her till I was tired. There was no one who could come to her assistance. When I had well pounded her, she swore that she would never visit me again. Then for the first time I perceived that I had acted very wrongly, for I was losing a grand model who brought me honor through my art. Moreover, I saw her body all torn and bruised and swollen. I reflected that even if I persuaded her to return, I should have to put her under medical treatment for at least a fortnight before I could make use of her. Chapter 35. Well, to return to Caterina, I sent my old serving woman named Roberta, who had a most kindly disposition, to help her dress. She brought food and drink to the miserable baggage, and after rubbing a little bacon fat into her worst wounds, they ate what was left of the meat together. When she had finished dressing, she went off blaspheming and cursing all Italians in the king's service, and so returned with tears and murmurs to her home. Assuredly, upon that first occasion I felt I had done very wrong, and Roberta rebuked me after this fashion: "You are a cruel monster to maltreat such a handsome girl so brutally." When I excused my conduct by narrating all the tricks which she and her mother had played off upon me under my own roof, Roberta scoldingly replied that that was nothing. That was only French manners, and she was sure there was not a husband in France without his horns. When I heard this argument, I laughed aloud, and I told Roberta to go and see how Caterina was, since I should like to employ her again while finishing the work I had on hand. The old woman took me sharply up, saying that I had no savoir-vivre. Only wait till daybreak. She will come of herself, whereas if you send to ask after her or visit her, she will give herself airs and keep away. On the following morning, Caterina came to our door, and knocked so violently that, being below, I ran to see whether it was a madman or some member of the household. When I opened, the creature laughed and fell upon my neck, embracing and kissing me, and asked me if I was still angry with her. I said no. Then she added, "Let me have something good to break my fast on." So I supplied her well with food, and partook of it at the same table in a sign of reconciliation. Afterwards I began to model from her, during which occurred some amorous diversions. And at last, just at the same hour as on the previous day, she irritated me to such a pitch that I gave her the same drubbing. So we went on several days, repeating the old round like clockwork. There was little or no variation in the incidents. Meanwhile I completed my work in a style which did me the greatest credit. Next I set about it cast in bronze. This entailed some difficulties, to relate which would be interesting from the point of view of art, but since the whole history would occupy too much space, I must omit it. Suffice it to say that the figure came out splendidly, and was as fine a specimen of foundry as had ever been seen. Chapter 36. While this work was going forward, I set aside certain hours of the day for the salt cellar, and certain others for the Jupiter. There were more men engaged upon the former than I had at my disposal for the latter, so the salt cellar was by this time completely finished. The king had now returned to Paris, and when I paid him my respects, I took the piece with me. As I have already related, it was oval in form, standing about 2/3 of a cubit, wrought of solid gold, and worked entirely with a chisel. While speaking of the model, I said before how I had represented sea and earth, seated, with their legs interlaced, as we observe in the case of firths and promontories. This attitude was therefore metaphorically appropriate. The sea carried a trident in his right hand, in his left I put a ship of delicate workmanship to hold the salt. Below him were his 4 seahorses, fashioned like our horses from the head to the front hoofs. All the rest of their body, from the middle backwards, resembled a fish, and the tails of these creatures were agreeably interwoven. Above this group the sea sat throned in an attitude of pride and dignity. Around him were many kinds of fishes and other creatures of the ocean. The water was represented with its waves and enameled in the appropriate color. I had portrayed earth under the form of a very handsome woman, holding her horn of plenty, entirely nude like the male figure. In her left hand I placed a little temple of Ionic architecture, most delicately wrought, which was meant to contain the pepper. Beneath her were the handsomest living creatures which the earth produces, and the rocks were partly enameled, partly left in gold. The whole piece reposed upon a base of ebony, properly proportioned, but with a projecting cornice upon which I introduced 4 golden figures in rather more than half relief. They represented night, day, twilight, and dawn. I put, moreover, into the same frieze 4 other figures, similar in size and intended for the 4 chief winds. These were executed and in part enameled with the most exquisite refinement. When I exhibited this piece to His Majesty, he uttered a loud outcry of astonishment, and could not satiate his eyes with gazing at it. Then he bade me take it back to my house, saying he would tell me at the proper time what I should have to do with it. So I carried it home, and sent at once to invite several of my best friends. We dined gaily together, placing the salt cellar in the middle of the table, and thus we were the first to use it. After this I went on working at my Jupiter in silver, and also at the great vase I have already described, which was richly decorated with a variety of ornaments and figures. Chapter 37. At that time Bologna, the painter, suggested to the king that it would be well if His Majesty sent him to Rome, with letters of recommendation, to the end that he might cast the foremost masterpieces of antiquity, namely the Laocoon, the Cleopatra, the Venus, the Commodus, the Zingara, and the Apollo. These, of a truth, are by far the finest things in Rome. He told the king that when His Majesty had once set eyes upon these marvelous works, he would then, and not till then, be able to criticize the arts of design, since everything which he had seen by us moderns was far removed from the perfection of the ancients. The king accepted his proposal, and gave him the introductions he required. Accordingly, the beast went off, and took his bad luck with him. Not having the force and courage to contend with his own hands against me, he adopted the truly Lombard device of depreciating my performances by becoming a copyist of antiques. In its own proper place I shall relate how, though he had these statues excellently cast, he obtained a result quite contrary to his imagination. I had now done for ever with that disreputable Caterina, and the unfortunate young man, her husband, had decamped from Paris. Wanting then to finish off my Fontainebleau, which was already cast in bronze, as well as to execute the 2 Victories, which were going to fill the angles above the lunette of the door, I engaged a poor girl of the age of about 15. She was beautifully made, and of a brunette complexion, being somewhat savage in her ways and spare of speech, quick in movement, with a look of sullenness about her eyes. I nicknamed her Scorzone. Her real name was Jean. With her for model, I gave perfect finish to the bronze Fontainebleau, and also to the 2 Victories. Now this girl was a clean maid, and I got her with child. She gave birth to a daughter on the 7th of June, at 13 hours of the day, in 1544, when I had exactly reached the age of 44. I named the infant Costanza, and Mr. Guido Guidi, the king's physician and my most intimate friend, as I have previously related, held her at the font. He was the only godfather, for it is customary in France to have but one godfather and 2 godmothers. One of the latter was Madame Maddalena, wife to Monsieur Luigi Alamini, a gentleman of Florence and an accomplished poet. The other was the wife of Monsieur Riccardo del Bene, our Florentine burgher, and a great merchant in Paris. She was herself a French lady of distinguished family. This was the first child I ever had, so far as I remember. I settled money enough upon the girl for dowry to satisfy an aunt of hers, under whose tutelage I placed her, and from that time forwards I had nothing more to do with her. Chapter 38. By laboring incessantly, I had now got my various works well forward. The Jupiter was nearly finished, and the vase also. The door began to reveal its beauties. At that time the king came to Paris, and though I gave the right date of the year 1544 for my daughter's birth, we were still in 1543. But an opportunity of mentioning my daughter having arisen, I availed myself of it so as not to interrupt the narrative of more important things. Well, the king, as I have said, came to Paris, and paid me a visit soon after his arrival. The magnificent show of works brought well nigh to completion was enough to satisfy anybody's eye, and indeed it gave that glorious monarch no less contentment than the artist who had worked so hard upon them desired. While inspecting these things, it came into his head that the Cardinal of Ferrara had fulfilled none of his promises to me, either as regarded a pension or anything else. Whispering with his admiral, he said that the Cardinal of Ferrara had behaved very badly in the matter, and that he intended to make it up to me himself, because he saw I was a man of few words, who, in the twinkling of an eye, might decamp without complaining or asking leave. On returning home, his Majesty, after dinner, told the Cardinal to give orders to his Treasurer of the Exchequer that he should pay me at an early date 7,000 crowns of gold, in 3 or 4 installments, according to his own convenience, provided only that he executed the commission faithfully. At the same time he repeated words to this effect: "I gave Benvenuto into your charge, and you have forgotten all about him." The Cardinal said that he would punctually perform his Majesty's commands, but his own bad nature made him wait till the king's fit of generosity was over. Meanwhile, wars and rumors of wars were on the increase. It was the moment when the Emperor, with a huge army, was marching upon Paris. Seeing the realm of France to be in a great need of money, the Cardinal one day began to talk of me, and said, "Sacred Majesty, acting for the best, I have not had the money given to Benvenuto. First, it is sorely wanted now for public uses. Secondly, so great a donation would have exposed you to the risk of losing Benvenuto altogether, for if he found himself a rich man, he might have invested his money in Italy, and the moment some caprice took of him, he would have decamped without hesitation. I therefore consider that your Majesty's best course will be to present him with something in your kingdom, if you want to keep him in your service for any length of time." The king, being really in want of money, approved of these arguments. Nevertheless, like the noble soul he was, and truly worthy of his royal station, he judged rightly that the Cardinal had acted thus in order to curry favour, rather than from any clear provisions of distressed finances in so vast a realm. Chapter 39. As I have just said, his Majesty affected to concur with the Cardinal, but his own private mind was otherwise made up. Accordingly, upon the day after his arrival, without solicitation upon my part, he came of his own accord to my house. I went to meet him, and conducted him through several rooms where diverse works of art were on view. Beginning with the less important, I pointed out a quantity of things in bronze, and it was long since he had seen so many at once. Then I took him to see the Jupiter in silver, now nearly complete, with all its splendid decorations. It so happened that a grievous disappointment, which he had suffered a few years earlier, made him think this piece more admirable than it might perhaps have appeared to any other man. The occasion to which I refer was this. After the capture of Tunis, the Emperor passed through Paris with the consent of his brother-in-law, King Francis, who wanted to present him with something worthy of so great a potentate. Having thus in view, he ordered a Hercules to be executed in silver, exactly of the same size as my Jupiter. The king declared this Hercules to be the ugliest work of art that he had ever seen, and spoke his opinion plainly to the craftsmen of Paris. They vaunted themselves to be the ablest craftsmen in the world for works of this kind, and informed the king that nothing more perfect could possibly have been produced in silver, insisting at the same time upon being paid 2,000 ducats for the filthy piece of work. This made the king, when he beheld mine, affirm that the finish of its workmanship exceeded his highest expectations. Accordingly, he made an equitable judgment, and had my statue valued almost at 2,000 ducats, saying, "I gave those other men no salary. Cellini, who gets about 1,000 crowns a year from me, can surely let me have this masterpiece for 2,000 crowns of gold, since he has his salary into the bargain." Then I exhibited other things in gold and silver, and a variety of models for new undertakings, and at the last, just when he was taking leave, I pointed out upon the lawn of the castle that great giant, which roused him to a higher astonishment than any of the other things he had inspected. Turning to his admiral, who was called Monsignor Annibale, he said, since the cardinal had made him no provision, we must do so, and all the more because the man himself is slow at asking favors. To cut it short, I mean to have him well provided for. Yes, these men who ask for nothing feel that their masterpieces call aloud for recompense. Therefore, see that he gets the first abbey that falls vacant worth 2,000 crowns a year. If this cannot be had in one benefice, let him have 2 or 3 to that amount, for in his case it will come to the same thing. As I was standing by, I could hear what the king said, and thanked his majesty at once for the donation, as though I were already in possession. I told him that as soon as his orders were carried into effect, I would work for his majesty without other salary or recompense of any kind until old age deprived me of the power to labor, when I hoped to rest my tired body in peace, maintaining myself with honor on that income, and always bearing in mind that I had served so great a monarch as his majesty. At the end of the speech the king turned towards me with a lively gesture and a joyous countenance, saying, "So let it then be done." After that he departed, highly satisfied with what he had seen there. End of Section 8. Of Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jersey City Frankie. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2, Section 9. Chapters 40 through 44. Chapter 40. Madame d'Etampes, when she'd heard how well my affairs were going, redoubled her spite against me, saying in her own heart, "It is I who rule the world today, and a little fellow like that snaps his fingers at me." She put every iron into the fire which she could think of in order to stir up mischief against me. Now a certain man fell in her way who enjoyed a great fame as a distiller. He supplied her with perfumed waters, which were excellent for the complexion and hitherto unknown in France. This fellow she introduced to the king, who was much delighted by the process for distilling which he exhibited. While engaged in these experiments, the man begged his majesty to give him a tennis court I had in my castle, together with some little apartments which he said I did not use. The good king, guessing who was at the bottom of the business, made no answer, but Madame d'Etampes used those wiles with which women know so well to work on men, and very easily succeeded in her enterprise. For having taken the king at a moment of amorous weakness, to which he was much subject, she wheedled him into conceding what she wanted. The distiller came, accompanied by Treasurer Grolier, a very great nobleman of France, who spoke Italian excellently, and when he entered my castle began to jest with me in that language. Watching his opportunity, he said, "In the king's name I put this man here into possession of that tennis court, together with the lodgings that pertain to it." To this I answered, "The sacred king is lord of all things here, so then you might have effected an entrance with more freedom. Coming thus with notaries and people of the court looks more like a fraud than the mandate of a powerful monarch. I assure you that, before I carry my complaints before the king, I shall defend my right in the way his majesty gave me orders 2 days since to do. I shall fling the man whom you have put upon me out of windows if I do not see a warrant under the king's own hand and seal." After this speech the treasurer went off threatening and grumbling, and I remained doing the same, without, however, beginning the attack at once. Then I went to the notaries, who had put the fellow in possession. I was well acquainted with them, and they gave me to understand that this was a formal proceeding, done indeed to the king's orders, but which had not any great significance. If I had offered some trifling opposition, the fellow would not have installed himself as he had done. The formalities were acts and customs of the court, which did not concern obedience to the king. Consequently, if I succeeded in ousting him, I should have acted rightly, and I should not incur any risk. This hint was enough for me, and next morning I had recourse to arms, and though the job cost me some trouble, I enjoyed it. Each day that followed I made an attack with stones, pikes, and arquebuses, firing, however, without ball. Nevertheless, I inspired such terror that no one dared to help my antagonist. Accordingly, when I noticed one day that his defense was feeble, I entered the house by force, and expelled the fellow, turning all his goods and chattels into the street. Then I betook me to the king, and told him that I had done precisely as his majesty had ordered, by defending myself against everyone who sought to hinder me in his service. The king laughed at the matter, and made me out new letters patent to secure me from further molestation. Chapter 41. In the meantime I brought my silver Jupiter to completion, together with its gilded pedestal, which I placed upon a wooden plinth that only showed a very little. Upon the plinth I introduced 4 little round balls of hard wood, more than half hidden in their sockets, like the nut of a crossbow. They were so nicely arranged that a child could push the statue forward and backwards, or turn it round with ease. Having arranged it thus to my mind, I went with it to Fontainebleau, where the king was then residing. At that time, Bologna, of whom I have already said so much, had brought from Rome his statues, and had cast them very carefully in bronze. I knew nothing about this, partly because he kept his doings very dark, and also because Fontainebleau is 40 miles distant from Paris. On asking the king where he wanted me to set up my Jupiter, Madame d'Etampes, who happened to be present, told him there was no place more appropriate than his own handsome gallery. This was, as we should say in Tuscany, a loggia, or more exactly, a large lobby. It ought indeed to be called a lobby, because what we mean by loggia is open at one side. The hall was considerably longer than 100 paces, decorated and very rich with pictures from the hand of that Admiral Rosso, our Florentine master. Among the pictures were arranged a great variety of sculptured works, partly in the round and partly in bas-relief. The breadth was about 12 paces. Now Bologna had brought all his antiques into this gallery, wrought with great beauty in bronze. He had placed them in a handsome row upon their pedestals, and they were, as I have said, the choicest of the Roman antiquities. Into this same gallery I took my Jupiter, and when I saw that grand parade, so artfully planned, I said to myself, "This is like running the gauntlet. Now may God assist me." I placed the statue, and having arranged it as well as I was able, waited for the coming of the king. The Jupiter was raising his thunderbolt with the right hand in the act to hurl it. His left hand held the globe of the world. Among the flames of the thunderbolt I had very cleverly introduced a torch of white wax. Now Madame d'Etampes detained the king till nightfall, wishing to do one of 2 mischiefs, either to prevent his coming, or else to spoil the effect of my work by its being shown off after dark. But as God has promised to those who trust in him, it turned out exactly opposite to her calculations, for when night came I set fire to the torch, which, standing higher than the head of Jupiter, shed light from above, and showed the statue far better than by daytime. At length the king arrived. He was attended by his Madame d'Etampes, his son the Dauphin and the Dauphiness, together with the King of Navarre, his brother-in-law, Madame Marguerite, his daughter, and several other great lords, who had been instructed by Madame d'Etampes to speak against me. When the king appeared, I made my prentice Ascanio push the Jupiter towards his majesty. As it moved smoothly forwards, my cunning in its turn was amply rewarded, for this gentle motion made the figure seem alive. The antiques were left in the background, and my work was the first to take the eye with pleasure. The king exclaimed at once, "This is by far the finest thing that has ever been seen, and I, although I am an amateur and judge of art, could never have conceived the 100th part of its beauty." The lords, whose cue it was to speak against me, now seemed as though they could not praise my masterpiece enough. Madame d'Etampes said boldly, "One would think you had no eyes. Don't you see all those fine bronzes from the antique behind there? In those consists the real distinction of this art, and not in that modern trumpery." Then the king advanced, and the others with him. After casting a glance at the bronzes, which were not shown to advantage from the lights being below them, he exclaimed, "Whoever wanted to injure this man has done him a great service, for the comparison of these admirable statues demonstrates the immeasurable superiority of his work in beauty and in art. Benvenuto deserves to be made much of, for his performances do not merely rival, but surpass the antique." In reply to this, Madame d'Etampes observed that my Jupiter would not make anything like so fine a show by daylight. Besides, one had to consider that I had put a veil upon my statue to conceal its faults. I had indeed flung a gauze veil with elegance and delicacy, over a portion of my statue, with the view of augmenting its majesty. This, when she had finished speaking, I lifted from beneath, uncovering the handsome genital members of the god, then tore the veil to pieces with vexation. She imagined I had disclosed those parts of the statue to insult her. The king noticed how angry she was, while I was trying to force some words out in my fury, so he wisely spoke in his own language precisely as follows. "Benvenuto, I forbid you to speak. Hold your tongue, and you shall have 1,000 times more wealth than you desire." Not being allowed to speak, I writhed my body in a rage. This made her grumble with redoubled spite, and the king departed sooner than he would otherwise have done, calling aloud, however, to encourage me, "I have brought from Italy the greatest man who ever lived, endowed with all the talents." Chapter 42. I left the Jupiter there, meaning to depart the next morning. Before I took horse, 1,000 crowns were paid me, partly for my salary and partly on account of moneys I had disbursed. Having received this sum, I returned with a light heart and satisfied to Paris. No sooner had I reached home and dined with merry cheer than I called for all my wardrobe, which included a great many suits of silk, choice furs, and also very fine cloth stuffs. From these I selected presents for my workpeople, giving each something according to his own desert, down to the servant girls and stable boys, in order to encourage them to aid me heartily. Being then refreshed in strength and spirit, I attacked the great statue of Mars, which I had set up solidly upon a frame of well-connected woodwork. Over this there lay a crust of plaster, about the eighth of a cubit in thickness, carefully modelled for the flesh of the Colossus. Lastly, I prepared a great number of moulds in separate pieces to compose the figure, intending to dovetail them together in accordance with the rules of art, and this task involved no difficulty. I will not here omit to relate something which may serve to give a notion of the size of this great work, and as at the same time is highly comic. It must first be mentioned that I had forbidden all the men who lived at my cost to bring light women into my house or anywhere within the castle precincts. Upon this point of discipline I was extremely strict. Now my lad Ascanio loved a very handsome girl, who returned his passion. One day she gave her mother the slip and came to see Ascanio at night. Finding that she would not take her leave, and being driven to his wits' ends to conceal her, like a person of resources he hit at last upon the plan of installing her inside the statue. There, in the head itself, he made her up a place to sleep in. This lodging she occupied some time, and he used to bring her forth at whiles with secrecy at night. I, meanwhile, having brought this part of the Colossus almost to completion, left it alone, and indulged my vanity a bit by exposing it to sight. It could indeed be seen by more than half Paris. The neighbors, therefore, took to climbing their house roofs, and crowds came on purpose to enjoy the spectacle. Now there was a legend in the city that my castle had from olden times been haunted by a spirit, though I never noticed anything to confirm this belief, and folk in Paris called it popularly by the name of Lemonio Boreo. The girl, while she sojourned in the statue's head, could not prevent some of her movements to and fro from being perceptible through its eye-holes. This made stupid people say that the ghost had got into the body of the figure, and was setting its eyes in motion, and its mouth, as though it were able to talk. Many of them went away in terror. Others, more incredulous, came to observe the phenomenon, and when they were unable to deny the flashing of the statue's eyes, they too declared their credence in a spirit, not guessing that there was a spirit in there, and sound young flesh to boot. Chapter 43. All this while I was engaged in putting my door together, with its several appurtenances. As it is no part of my purpose to include in this autobiography such things as annalists record, I have omitted the coming of the emperor with his great host, and the king's mustering of his whole army. At the time when these events took place, his majesty sought my advice with regard to the instantaneous fortification of Paris. He came on purpose to my house, and took me all round the city, and when he found that I was prepared to fortify the town with expedition on a sound plan, he gave express orders that all my suggestions should be carried out. His admiral was directed to command the citizens to obey me under pain of his displeasure. Now the admiral had been appointed through Madame d'Etampes' influence, rather than from any proof of his ability, for he was a man of little talent, He bore the name of Monsieur de Annabault, which in our tongue is Monseigneur de Annibale, but the French pronounce it so that they usually made it sound like Monseigneur Asino Biot. This animal then referred to Madame d'Etampes for advice upon the matter. She ordered him to summon Girolamo Bellarmino without loss of time. He was an engineer from Siena, at that time in Dieppe, which was rather more than a day's journey distant from the capital. He came at once, and set the work of fortification going on a very tedious method, which made me throw the job up. If the Emperor had pushed forward at this time, he might easily have taken Paris. People indeed said that when a treaty of peace was afterwards concluded, Madame d'Etampes, who took more part in it than anybody else, betrayed the king. I shall pass this matter over without further words, since it has nothing to do with the plan of my memoirs. Meanwhile, I worked diligently at the door, and finished the vase, together with 2 other of middling size, which I made of my own silver. At the end of those great troubles, the king came to take his ease a while in Paris. That accursed woman seemed born to be the ruin of the world. I ought, therefore, to think myself of some account, seeing she held me for her mortal enemy. Happening to speak one day with the good king about my matters, she abused me to such an extent that he swore, in order to appease her, he would take no more heed of me thenceforward than if he had never set eyes upon my face. These words were immediately brought me by a page of Cardinal Ferrara, called Il Villa, who said he had heard the king utter them. I was infuriated to such a pitch that I dashed my tools across the room and all the things I was at work on, made my arrangements to quit France, and went upon the spot to find the king. When he had dined, I was shown into a room where I found his Majesty in the company of a very few persons. After I had paid him the respects due to kings, he bowed his head with a gracious smile. This revived hope in me, so I drew nearer to his Majesty, for they were showing him some things in my own line of art, and after we had talked a while about such matters, he asked if I had anything worth seeing at my house, and next inquired when I should like him to come. I replied that I had some pieces ready to show his Majesty, if he pleased at once. He told me to go home, and he would come immediately. Chapter 44. I went accordingly, and waited for the good king's visit, who, it seems, had gone meanwhile to take leave of Madame d'Etampes. She asked whether he was bound, adding that she would accompany him, but when he informed her, she told him that she would not go, and begged him as a special favor not to go himself that day. She had to return to the charge more than twice before she shook the king's determination. However, he did not come to visit me that day. Next morning I went to his Majesty at the same hour, and no sooner had he caught sight of me than he swore it was his intention to come to me upon the spot. Going then, according to his wont, to take leave of his dear Madame d'Etampes, this lady saw that all her influence had not been able to divert him from his purpose. So she began with that biting tongue of hers to say the worst of me that could be insinuated against the deadly enemy of this most worthy crown of France. The good king appeased her by replying that the sole object of his visit was to administer such a scolding as should make me tremble in my shoes. This he swore to do upon his honor. Then he came to my house, and I conducted him through the certain rooms upon the basement, where I had put the whole of my great door together. Upon beholding it, the king was struck with stupefaction, and quite lost his cue for reprimanding me, as he had promised Madame d'Etampes. Still he did not choose to go away without finding some opportunity for scolding, so he began in this wise. "There is one most important matter, Benvenuto, which men of your sort, though full of talent, ought always to bear in mind. It is that you cannot bring your great gifts to light by your own strength alone. You show your greatness only through the opportunities we give you. Now, you ought to be a little more submissive, not so arrogant and headstrong. I remember that I gave you express orders to make me 12 silver statues, and this was all I wanted. You have chosen to execute a salt-cellar, and vases, and busts, and doors, and a heap of other things, which quite confound me when I consider how you have neglected my wishes and worked for the fulfillment of your own. If you mean to go on in this way, I shall presently let you understand what is my own method of procedure when I choose to have things done in my own way. I tell you, therefore, plainly, do your utmost to obey my commands, for if you stick to your own fancies, you will run your head against a wall." While he was uttering these words, his lords in waiting hung upon the king's lips. Seeing him shake his head, frown, and gesticulate, now with one hand and now with the other, the whole company of attendants therefore quaked with fear for me. But I stood firm, and let no breath of fear pass over me. End of section 9.
Section 10 of Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J. Martin. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2, Section 10, Chapters 2 through 4. Chapter 45. When he had wound up this sermon, agreed upon beforehand with his darling Madame d'Etampes, I bent one leg upon the ground and kissed his coat above the knee. Then I began my speech as follows. Sacred Majesty, I admit that all you have said is true. Only, in reply, I protest that my heart has ever been, by day and night, with all my vital forces, bent on serving you and executing your commands. If it appears to your Majesty that my actions contradict these words, let your Majesty be sure that Benvenuto was not at fault, but rather, possibly, my evil fate or adverse fortune, which has made me unworthy to serve the most admirable prince who ever blessed this earth. Therefore I crave your pardon. I was under the impression, however, that your Majesty had given me silver for one statue only. Having no more at my disposal, I could not execute others. So, with the surplus which remained for use, I made this vase to show your Majesty the grand style of the ancients. Perhaps you never had seen anything of the sort before. As for the salt cellar, I thought, if my memory does not betray me, that your Majesty on one occasion ordered me to make it of your own accord. The conversation falling upon something of the kind which had been brought for your inspection, I showed you a model made by me in Italy. You, following the impulse of your own mind, only had 1,000 golden ducats cut out for me to execute the piece withal, thanking me in addition for my hint, and what is more, I seem to remember that you commended me highly when it was completed. As regards the door, it was my impression that after we had chanced to speak about it at some time or other, your Majesty gave orders to your chief secretary, Monsieur Valerios, from whom the order passed to Monsieur de Marmange and Monsieur de la Fare, to this effect, that all these gentlemen should keep me going at the work, and see that I obtained the necessary funds. Without such commission I should certainly not have been able to advance so great an undertaking on my own resource. As for the bronze heads, the pedestal of Jupiter, and other such like things, I will begin by saying that I cast those heads upon my own account in order to become acquainted with French clays, of which, as a foreigner, I had no previous knowledge whatsoever. Unless I had made the experiment, I could not have set about casting larger works. Now, touching the pedestals, I have to say that I made them because I judged them necessary to the statues. Consequently, in all I have done, I have meant to act for the best, and at no point to swerve from your Majesty's expressed wishes. It is indeed true that I set that huge Colossus up to satisfy my own desire, paying for it from my own purse, even to the point which it has reached, because I thought that, you being the great king that you are, and I the trifling artist that I am, it was my duty to erect for your glory and my own a statue, the like of which the ancients never saw. Now at the last, having been taught that God is not inclined to make me worthy of so glorious a service, I beseech your Majesty, instead of the noble recompense you had in mind to give me for my labors, bestow upon me only one small trifle of your favor, and therewith the leave to quit your kingdom. At this instant, if you condescend to my request, I shall return to Italy, always thanking God and your Majesty for the happy hours which I have passed in serving you. Chapter 46. The king stretched forth his own hands and raised me very graciously. Then he told me that I ought to continue in his service, and that all I had done was right and pleasing to him. Turning to the lords in his company, he spoke these words precisely: "I verily believe that a finer door could not be made for paradise itself." When he had ceased speaking, although his speech had been entirely in my favor, I again thanked him respectfully, for the heat of my indignation had not yet cooled down. His Majesty, feeling that I set too little store upon his unwonted and extraordinary condescension, commanded me with a great and terrible voice to hold my tongue unless I wanted to incur his wrath. Afterwards he added that he would drown me in gold, and that he gave me the leave I asked, and over and above the works he had commissioned, he was very well satisfied with what I had done on my own account in the interval. I should never henceforth have any quarrels with him, because he knew my character, and for my part I too ought to study the temper of his Majesty as my duty required. I answered that I thanked God and his Majesty for everything. Then I asked him to come and see how far I had advanced the great Colossus. So he came to my house, and I had the statue uncovered. He admired it extremely, and gave orders to his secretary to pay me all the money I had spent upon it, be the sum what it might, provided I wrote the bill out in my own hand. Then he departed, saying, "Adieu, mon ami," which is a phrase not often used by kings. Chapter 47. After returning to his palace, he called to mind the words I had spoken in our previous interview, some of which were so excessively humble, and others so proud and haughty, that they caused him no small irritation. He repeated a few of them in the presence of Madame d'Etampes and Monsieur de Sepolo, a great baron of France. This man had always professed much friendship for me in the past, and certainly on that occasion he showed his good will after the French fashion, with great cleverness. It happened thus. The king, in the course of a long conversation, complained that the Cardinal of Ferrara, to whose care he had entrusted me, never gave a thought to my affairs. So far as he was concerned, I might have decamped from the realm. Therefore he must certainly arrange for committing me to someone who would appreciate me better, because he did not want to run a further risk of losing me. At these words, Monsieur de St. Paul expressed his willingness to undertake the charge, saying that if the king appointed him my guardian, he would act so that I should never have the chance to leave the kingdom. The king replied that he was very well satisfied, if only St. Paul would explain the way in which he meant to manage me. Madame sat by with an air of sullen irritation, and St. Paul stood on his dignity, declining to answer the king's question. When the king repeated it, he said, to curry favor with Madame d'Etampes, "I would hang that Benvenuto of yours by the neck, and thus you would keep him forever in your kingdom." She broke into a fit of laughter, protesting that I richly deserved it. The king, to keep them company, began to laugh, and said he had no objection to St. Paul hanging me, if he could first produce my equal in the arts, and although I had not earned such a fate, he gave full liberty and license. In this way that day ended, and I came off safe and sound, for which may God be praised and thanked. Chapter 48. The king had now made peace with the emperor, but not with the English, and these devils were keeping us in constant agitation. His Majesty had therefore other things than pleasure to attend to. He ordered Piero Strozzi to go with ships of war into the English waters, but this was a very difficult undertaking, even for that great commander, without a paragon in his time in the art of war, and also without a paragon in his misfortunes. Several months passed without my receiving money or commissions. Accordingly, I dismissed my work-people with the exception of the 2 Italians, whom I set to making 2 big vases out of my own silver, for these men could not work in bronze. After they had finished these, I took them to a city which belonged to the Queen of Navarre. It is called Argentana, and is distant several days' journey from Paris. On arriving at this place, I found that the king was indisposed, and the Cardinal of Ferrara told his Majesty that I was come. He made no answer, which obliged me to stay several days kicking my heels. Of a truth, I never was more uncomfortable in my life, but at last I presented myself one evening, and offered the 2 vases for the king's inspection. He was excessively delighted, and when I saw him in good humor, I begged his Majesty to grant me the favor of permitting me to travel into Italy. I would leave the 7 months of my salary which were due, and his Majesty might condescend to pay me when I required money for my return journey. I entreated him to grant this petition, seeing that the times were more for fighting than for making statues. Moreover, his Majesty had allowed a similar license to Bologna the painter, wherefore I humbly begged him to concede the same to me. While I was uttering these words, the king kept gazing intently on the vases, and from time to time shot a terrible glance at me. Nevertheless, I went on praying to the best of my ability that he would favor my petition. All of a sudden he rose angrily from his seat and said to me in Italian, "Benvenuto, you are a great fool. Take these vases back to Paris. I want to have them gilt." Without making any other answer, he then departed. I went up to the Cardinal of Ferrara, who was present, and besought him, since he had already conferred upon me the great benefit of freeing me from prison in Rome, with many other besides, to do me this one favor more of procuring for me leave to travel into Italy. He answered that he should be very glad to do his best to gratify me in this matter. I might leave it without further thought to him, and even if I chose might set off at once, because he would act for the best in my interest with the king. I told the cardinal that since I was aware his Majesty had put me under the protection of his most reverend lordship, if he gave me leave, I felt ready to depart, and promised to return upon the smallest hint from his reverence. The cardinal then bade me go back to Paris and wait there 8 days, during which time he would procure the king's license for me. If his Majesty refused to let me go, he would without fail inform me, but if I received no letters, that would be a sign that I might set off with an easy mind. Chapter 49. I obeyed the cardinal and returned to Paris, where I made excellent cases for my 3 silver vases. After the lapse of 20 days, I began my preparations and packed the 3 vases upon a mule. This animal had been lent me for the journey to Lyons by the Bishop of Pavia, who was now once more installed in my castle. Then I departed in my evil hour, together with Signor Ippolito Gangazza, at that time in the pay of the king, and also in the service of the Count Goletta de Mirandola. Some other gentlemen of the said count went with us, as well as Leonardo Tedaldi, our fellow citizen of Florence. I made Ascanio and Pagolo guardians of my castle and all my property, including 2 little vases which were only just begun. Those I left behind in order that the 2 young men might not be idle. I had lived very handsomely in Paris, and therefore there was a large amount of costly household furniture. The whole value of these effects exceeded 1,500 crowns. I bade Ascanio remember what great benefits I had bestowed upon him, and that up to the present he had been a mere thoughtless lad. The time was now come for him to show the prudence of a man. Therefore I thought fit to leave him in the custody of all my goods, as also of my honor. If he had the least thing to complain of from those brutes of Frenchmen, he was to let me hear at once, because I would take post and fly from any place in which I found myself, not only to discharge the great obligations under which I lay to that good king, but also to defend my honor. Ascanio replied with the tears of a thief and hypocrite, "I have never known a father better than you are, and all things which a good son is bound to perform for a good father will I ever do for you." So then I took my departure, attended by a servant and a little French lad. It was past noon when some of the king's treasurers, by no means friends of mine, made a visit to my castle. The rascally fellows began by saying that I had gone off with the king's silver and told Messer Guido and the Bishop of Pavia to send at once off after his Majesty's vases. If not, they would themselves dispatch a messenger to get them back and do me some great mischief. The bishop and Messer Guido were much more frightened than was necessary, so they sent that traitor Ascanio by the post off on the spot. He made his appearance before me at about midnight. I had not been able to sleep, and kept revolving thoughts to the following effect: in whose hands have I left my property, my castle? Oh, what a fate is this of mine, which forces me to take this journey! May God grant only that the cardinal is not of one mind with Madame d'Etampes, who has nothing else so much at heart as to make me lose the grace of that good king. Chapter 50. While I was thus dismally debating with myself, I heard Ascanio calling me. On the instant I jumped out of bed and asked if he brought good or evil tidings. The knave answered, "They are good news I bring, but you must only send back those 3 vases, for the rascally treasurers keep shouting, 'Stop, thief!' So the bishop and Messer Guido say that you must absolutely send them back. For the rest you need have no anxiety, but may pursue your journey with a light heart." I handed over the vases immediately, 2 of them being my own property, together with the silver and much else besides. I had meant to take them to the Cardinal of Ferrara's Abbey at Lyons, for though people accused me of wanting to carry them into Italy, everybody knows quite well that it is impossible to export money, gold, or silver from France without special license. Consider, therefore, whether I could have crossed the frontier with these 3 great vases, which, together with their cases, were a whole mule's burden. It is certainly true that, since these articles were of great value and the highest beauty, I felt uneasiness in case the king should die, and I had lately left him in a very bad state of health. Therefore I said to myself, if such an accident should happen, having these things in the keeping of the cardinal, I shall not lose them. Well, to cut the story short, I sent back the mule with the vases and other things of importance. Then, upon the following morning, I travelled forward with the company I have already mentioned, nor could I through the whole journey refrain from sighing and weeping. Sometimes, however, I consoled myself with God by saying, "Lord God, before whose eyes the truth lies open, Thou knowest that my object in this journey is only to carry alms to 6 poor miserable virgins and their mother, my own sister. They have indeed their father, but he is very old and gains nothing by his trade. I fear, therefore, lest they might too easily take to a bad course of life. Since, then, I am performing a true act of piety, I look to thy Majesty for aid and counsel." This was all the recreation I enjoyed upon my forward journey. We were 1 day distant from Lyons, and it was close upon the hour of 22 when the heavens began to thunder with sharp rattling claps, although the sky was quite clear at the time. I was riding a crossbow shot before my comrades. After the thunder the heavens made a noise so great and horrible that I thought the last day had come, so I reined in for a moment, while a shower of hail began to fall without a drop of water. A first hail was somewhat larger than pellets from a pop-gun, and when these struck me they hurt considerably. Little by little it increased in size until the stones might be compared to balls from a crossbow. My horse became restive with fright, so I wheeled round and returned at a gallop to where I found my comrades taking refuge in a fir wood. The hail now grew to the size of big lemons. I began to sing a misery, and while I was devoutly uttering this psalm to God, there fell a stone so huge that it smashed the thick branches of the pine under which I had retired for safety. Another of the hailstones hit my horse upon the head and almost stunned him. One struck me also, but not directly, else it would have killed me. In like manner, poor old Leonardo Tedaldi, who like me was kneeling on the ground, received so shrewd a blow that he fell grovelling upon all fours. When I saw that the furbeau offered no protection, and that I ought to act as well as to intone my miseries, I began at once to wrap my mantle round my head. At the same time I cried to Leonardo, who was shrieking for succor, Jesus, Jesus, that Jesus would help him if he helped himself. I had more trouble in looking after this man's safety than my own. The storm raged for some while, but at last it stopped, and we, who were pounded black and blue, scrambled as well as we could upon our horses. Pursuing the way to our lodging for the night, we showed our scratches and bruises to each other, but about a mile further on we came upon a scene of devastation which surpassed what we had suffered, and defies description. All the trees were stripped of their leaves and shattered. The beasts in the field lay dead. Many of the herdsmen had also been killed. We observed large quantities of hailstones which could not have been grasped with 2 hands. Feeling then that we had come well out of a great peril, we acknowledged that our prayers to God and miseries had helped us more than we could have helped ourselves. Returning thanks to God, therefore, we entered Lyons in the course of the next day, and tarried there 8 days. At the end of this time, being refreshed in strength and spirit, we resumed our journey, and passed the mountains without mishap. On the other side I bought a little pony, because the baggage which I carried had somewhat overtired my horses. End of section 10.